Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's office hours. For those of you that I haven't met or virtually met yet, I am Jennifer Splansky Jester, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum. Thanks so much for joining us, and we hope this finds you, your loved ones, colleagues, and community safe and in good health. This is now our 5th weekly chat as part of the Managing Change in Rapidly Changing Times. Yes, time is an odd concept these days, but this is number 5. So we are really glad to have you with us. I suspect some of you are joining us for the first time and others might have joined some of our previous office hour sessions. So before we go any further, I want to take a moment to recognize the land that we are on. We'd like to acknowledge that this office hours is presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Ohlone people, the Potawatomi people, the Coast Salish, and the Duwamish people. So we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Ohlone, Potawatomi, Coast Salish, and Duwamish people. So in these weekly office hours that the Collective Impact Forum has been holding over the past few weeks, we've been really enjoying keeping things casual and working through questions that we've received from you beforehand and that we received during the session. And so we want to hear from you. We'll start off with a few of the questions we received in advance, but we welcome you to use the Q&A box in the Zoom platform to share questions that come up for you in real time. We also will make a recording of today's conversation available within 24 hours, and we will send you an email once it is available. So as I mentioned, please do use the Q&A box on your screen to ask questions. If you want to engage with the full group or share resources, you also can use the chat function. So feel free to pick whichever way is easiest for you to engage. You can also, of course, use social media to share things that are coming up for you or reflections or responses as we go. And if you have technical questions, you can use the Q&A box or email us at info@collectiveimpactforum.org. So let's see. I guess it's a disclaimer. We are still adjusting to using the Zoom webinar platform after many years of a different platform, GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar. So if anything is a little bit clunky or a little awkward, bear with us as we learn our way into this platform. So as we've done in our other office hours, we're going to start by taking a status check of how everyone's doing today. Up on the screen here, you see a tool that is really something that my colleague Tracy, who's actually running the backside of the webinar today, developed for our team to use for internal status checks. We actually developed this a while back, and it's always been really helpful for us in just touching base and connecting with each other on how we're doing. And we actually, based on some feedback from previous office hours, adapted the tool so that rather than just taking our work commitments into account, we also are thinking about our whole lives, because I think I can speak for myself and for many of us, the lines between personal and professional have really blurred given all of our commitments and given the crisis that we now find ourselves in. And so we wanted to make this tool more holistic than just looking at the work context. So we actually are going to ask you all how you're doing using a poll. And Tracy's going to launch that poll. So we'd love to hear from you. How are you doing today? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, or gray? All right, how are we doing, Tracy?
Great, just leave it up for one more second if anyone else wants to share, and then we'll close.
Great, so you can see the results here on the screen. About half of you are showing that you're yellow. Lots going on, but managing okay. And then about 20 to 30%, 20% in the orange and about almost 30% in the green. And as I hypothesized on previous office hours, I suspect maybe red folks don't have the time to join our office hours. And we know many folks in our communities are in that red zone. So glad to have you all with us today. And we also certainly encourage you to adapt and use a tool like this for checking in with your colleagues. All right. So before we turn over to Q&A, we're going to just share a few slides. As I mentioned, I anticipate some of you have been with us in previous weeks. And so there are a few things that Paul and Junious have shared previously that I'm going to quickly voice over. We have the date of the original office hours where this content was presented in much more detail on the slide here. And all of the recordings are up on the Collective Impact Forum website if you want to go back and listen to more. So Paul has created some thoughts around the role of and considerations for collective impact initiatives during this time of the pandemic. And we have a list of 10 here. I'm not going to read through all of these, but I do want to highlight a couple considerations for collective impact initiatives. And often this starts with those who are playing the backbone role and really facilitating the collaborative. And the first one, I think it's here, number one, for a reason. You are going to probably go off plan, and you might not make the performance measures that you've set out or reach the milestones you previously planned, and that is okay. We're going to talk actually later about some scenario planning and making adjustments, but that's where we find ourselves these days. And adjusting is not only okay, frankly, it's necessary right now because the context has shifted so much. Another thing that I want to emphasize here is really looking at how the collective impact platform can serve the local system leaders. What I'm looking at number 6 here. What do local system leaders need? And can some of the skills and assets that your collective impact initiative, your collaborative has developed be in service of broader and different efforts right now? And I think the last one I want to emphasize here is number 10. Be empathetic and patient with colleagues' pace and productivity. I sense that many of you may already be seeing that people are responding and processing and coping in different ways. And as we work with each other as humans, as people, really starting from a place of empathy and being patient with others right now is really truly essential. I won't do justice to all 10 of these like Paul has, so I do encourage you to go back and listen to, for example, the March 26th office hours. And if any of these bring up questions for you, put them in the Q&A box and we'll talk about them today. We've also shared what is called a strategy triage tool. So to the point of, you're probably going to go off plan and that's okay. It can help to bring a little bit of structure to thinking about how you adjust and adapt. And we did share and talk through an example of using this strategy triage tool that was created by Marianne Orkia at Strategy Lift. And this tool has really resonated with people in thinking about how to adjust in these times, how to think about what makes sense to prioritize, what makes sense to pause, what might be a new priority, and what components of your work are just unknown right now and need to have additional time or consideration to play out. And then finally at the bottom, you'll see there are some things that you might just need to honor and let go of. For the foreseeable future, they may just not be a strategic priority. So this is a tool that can really be helpful in thinking about managing priorities in and through the time of crisis. Another piece I want to share here was developed by Junious Williams, who is also on the line. And Junious developed this set of concentric circles to think about the different spheres that collective impact initiatives can be considering and investing in and prioritizing their time, energy, and resources and expertise right now. And I think this framework is really helpful in thinking about the role of collective impact initiatives in immediate crisis response, as well as in and through the medium to longer term. And so Junious, you may want to say more about this when we go into Q&A. But right in the center, we want to stress that it is still important to invest in the collaborative management and maintenance so that that infrastructure is there and continues to be in place as an asset in coronavirus response, recovery, rebuilding, reconstruction, etc. And then thinking about how the collaborative in the near term can use its infrastructure in emergency management and crisis response. And similarly, in the third circle out, how can the strategies and expertise that the collaborative has and the partners around the table have be relevant in this time of crisis? And then as we go out into the further three rings, these are more intended to capture the role of the collective in some of the recovery and rebuilding. So how can the knowledge and strategies that your collaborative has identified be useful in the recovery and rebuilding, of course, adapted for the new reality we find ourselves in? The second to last circle introduces the idea of thinking about your common agenda or your collective work with perhaps a broader social determinants of health frame. So thinking about all of the varied impacts on not only certainly health, but all of the social determinants, frankly, of well-being of individuals and communities. So economic stability, housing stability, and other areas, all of which are going to contribute to wellness. And then finally, there's so much data that we are seeing about the way that the COVID crisis is having inequitable impacts on communities and communities of color in particular across the country. And the more evidence of this comes out, the more we see health disparities and inequities that many of us certainly have known exist, but this is putting it in headlines perhaps more than ever. And collective impact initiatives, we have been having a call to action to put equity at the center of that work, and collaboratives can play a super important role in ensuring that equity is at the center of the reckoning and rebuilding efforts that need to happen coming out of this crisis. So I think we'll get into a lot of these as we get into Q&A, but I wanted to present this framework as a helpful thing for folks to consider as you think about the role of your collective in the short and in the medium to longer term. Before I go on, I want to just share a couple. Junious put together another helpful tool, set of resources on teleconferencing. So of course, we're all finding ourselves in, many folks are calling it the vortex of Zoom or lots of virtual meetings. But here are some resources on teleconferencing that you may find helpful in working with your collaborative. Paul and Junious, before I hand it to Paul for sharing a new tool for today, is there anything you'd like to add, adapt, or amend to what I just shared?
No, good job.
Oof. All right. Paul, I'm going to hand it to you. And before I do, I realize I didn't do a formal introduction. I suspect many of you have been in sessions with Junious Williams and Paul Schmitz before. They are both senior advisors to the Collective Impact Forum. I'll save time and not do their full bios, but if you're curious, we do have bios for them on our website, and they're just always lucky to work with them. All right, so Paul, I will drive the slides, but why don't you tell us a little bit about this tool you've adapted?
Yeah, a couple weeks ago on the call, a few people asked about how to plan for the future and how to think of scenarios in the future. And I went back to some resources, a booklet and book that I had worked with a few years ago to learn and actually had worked with Catherine Fulton, the Monitor Institute, to do scenario thinking and try to figure out how could we adapt that whole process into a tool that people could use for the next 6 to 9 months. And basically, the important thing about scenario thinking is it's not about predicting the future. You're not trying to figure out what's going to happen. What you're trying to do is imagine a range of options that are all quite possible and plausible. And then your role is to look at your strategy and think, how would we adapt our strategy across these options? So the goal is not to predict the future. The goal is to prepare for possible futures. The way the tool works, and we posted a blog today, and there'll be also a handout tool that you can download later today on the Collective Impact Forum blog. But the first thing is to clarify what your question is. And let's just say like you run, you're doing after school programming, and the question is, so how would we, what are we going to do in the fall, right? Like that's the question, like what opportunities and options are we going to have in the fall? Well, then you have to ask, what are the driving forces around that? What are the things that are externally going to push on that? And to think of them as like a range. So whether schools are open or not, how the economy is doing, where the COVID crisis is at in our community in terms of beyond or within the healthcare capacity. We then prioritize those. We come up with a list of what we think are driving forces that would potentially impact our ability to do our work. We then prioritize though based on two things, which are the degree of importance on whether schools will be open and the degree of uncertainty surrounding those forces. Once we have those, if you could go to the next slide. Jennifer, if you go to the, yeah. We could see like these are examples. And so like in each driving force, we think of them as two poles, like economic growth and decline, economic recovery begins. No meetings of more than 20 people still, meetings of any size can be organized, schools open. But what we do is we prioritize those, choose 2 or 3 of those combinations that we think are most important to our work. And then what we do is we cross them. And if you could go to the next slide. And so if we take this example, on the vertical axis, we have either economic recovery begins or economic growth still in decline. And on the horizontal axis, we have schools open fully in the fall, or we have that schools are closed or limited and there's no extracurricular activities still for schools. And then what that does is give us 4 boxes. And in those 4 boxes, what we can do is start to develop scenarios in each of those 4 boxes. What might the world look like in each of those boxes? If economic recovery is starting to begin, if we're done slumping and things are starting to grow again and schools are open, what would things look like for ourselves, for our schools, for our, and I'm using that example, for our youth centers, what might it look like for the families, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, if schools are fully open, but the economy is still in decline, what might that mean for our organization, for the school district, for philanthropy, for public policy, for the children we serve, for parents, and really think through each scenario, walk through how people would be impacted by that. And then if you could go to the next slide. Once you have those 4 scenario narratives, then the goal is to look at your strategy and say, how could we plan in ways that could approach all, because all 4 of those are plausible at this point scenarios. All 4 of those could be the case. We can't predict, we don't know. But what we can do is look at our strategy and say, how would our after school strategy be different in the orange box than the green box, or in the purple box than the red box? And we can look at our strategy and think about how it might alter and start to prepare ourselves for operating in those different zones. It's a tool that people have used for a long time. Peter Schwartz first kind of made it famous in his book, The Art of the Long View, back in the mid-90s. And I also, in the blog, added a comment with a paper that actually Liz Weaver from Tamarack sent me, of a German institute that actually posted their scenario thinking about 4 potential post-COVID worlds. And it uses this same model. It's a model that's often used by groups that are doing that kind of planning. Of course, usually people are thinking 5 to 10 years out. And we're more uncertain about the next 6 to 9 months in some ways than we are 5 to 10 years. And so it's a tool that might be helpful. Again, it came from questions people were asking. There's a blog that explains more, and now there's that example attached to it, and then there's the tool. So feel free to have at it if it's useful and helpful to you in your planning. And we'll look forward to jumping into questions now.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. I think it's very practical, and you've done a nice job of adapting it for the current moment. And I think this tool and the strategy triage tool that we shared a couple slides ago are great resources. I was just going to mention another set of tools that I learned of this week that were created by Julia Lynn at Policy Solve. She's created some tools that are thinking more about like the medium to longer term. Yeah. And looking at, so one of them is a journey mapping tool, which really helps you think about mapping from your past priorities through the crisis and into the future, and thinking about strategic shifts, identifying policy windows and things that can help you really think about your medium to longer term strategy based on kind of looking back and looking forward. And I think she puts together a nice, very accessible journey mapping tool. And then for a bit of a deeper dive, she has put together a set of like strategic refresh questions to help you consider building on previous assets, looking into the future, and looking for kind of policy and strategy windows of opportunity. So I definitely suggest checking those out as well. And we can put a link to those in the chat box too. So with that, I'm going to stop the screen share and take us over into Q&A. So I'm going to start with a couple questions we got in advance, and then we'll also monitor the real-time Q&A box. So let's start with this one. So how do you shift priorities when priorities of partners will be different than pre-COVID? How can we prepare for kind of collaborative strategy shifting as well as our partners' priorities shifting?
Junious, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think, and we've said this repeatedly over the course of the last several weeks, that the most dangerous thing that people can do right now is make a lot of assumptions. And if you're working and helping to support a collaborative, you just need to ask people. And it goes back to Jen's earlier point with respect to patience with folks and realizing that productivity may be off. So I think the first stage is just an assessment. What kind of bandwidth do people have, and what's a priority on everybody's plates within their respective organizations, and is there any common ground that may become an interim focus for the collaborative work? But it's really organic. And if there's nothing there, my advice to people is don't push it. If everybody has been scattered around firefighting on all of these fronts that everybody has, then there may not be any collaborative work right now, and that's okay. My only concern, though, and I've expressed it to some of my clients, is you've got to be careful about not becoming invisible. And because when this is over, there's going to be a real competition for resources. And if you're unable to associate your collaborative with any of the sort of emergency response, then you may position yourself where people start asking, are you really necessary and needed? And as philanthropy diverts its resources to backing up the government's failure in terms of the safety net, dollars are going to be really hard. So I know that that's kind of self-interest, but one of the obligations of the backbone and others is the sustainability of the collaborative work. So I don't think it's inappropriate to be thinking about, is there a way that we kind of maintain some name recognition and association of our work with things that are responding to the immediate need in the community?
Thanks, Junious. Paul, I wanted to ask you, I think folks are often interested in learning about what other communities are doing and how other communities are responding. And I know you shared with me a little bit about some interesting things happening in Milwaukee. And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I know that one of the things that's been interesting to see and exciting in a way is that collective impacts have been called upon to kind of flex those muscles in ways unrelated to their plan. And so what I found is if we take in Milwaukee, the Greater Milwaukee Foundation and Milwaukee Succeeds are actually driving what they're calling their civic response teams. And they have teams around homelessness and sheltering. They have a team on food. They have a team on schools. And they're coordinating, their leaders are coordinating with the mayor, and they are meeting every week. They have a Slack channel. And basically, the backbone that's supposed to be doing cradle to career is now doing civic response across all these issues that normally wouldn't be in its purview, but they have the systems, they have the skills, they have the ability. I know in Chattanooga, I've been working with Chattanooga 2.0. Similarly, that staff has been heavily involved in not trying to just like work on their issue, but trying to figure out how to like support emerging response. In Jackson, Michigan, the Jackson Community Foundation similarly has been an active seat at the table and helping use their coalition. There was a great headline in their local newspaper about how their collective impact effort built those collaborative muscles they're using now. So that's why I put that in the original blog and in that place, is I think to get away, to not think about your issue as much as think about what the need of the community and especially of the populations you serve are right now. And think about how can you, with your capacities and assets, be of support to the community. And I think to Junius's point before, that's how you stay relevant. And people appreciate that. People aren't going to be like, well, you didn't make your metrics on third grade reading for the quarter, so we're not going to fund you, when you spent all that time making sure every family had food and that homeless children were housed and like people were contact traced. People are going to be like, holy shit, you're amazing. So like, I think the key thing I'm seeing is these collective impacts that are really leaning into using their skills, muscles, experience to help drive response. And they'll eventually migrate back to their strategies, but I think that's been one of the exciting things to see, and it's happened organically all over the place.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, definitely. Let's see. Okay, so back to this question that's come in here real time. So several people, this is back to the poll that we did. So if several people, if we use a poll like this with our colleagues, if several people are in the red or blue-gray areas, what do you do with that information besides acknowledging their feelings at that time? And Paul, this relates a little bit to another question, which I think you actually typed an answer to, is, how do you manage working with folks who are finding it hard to focus and step back? So related questions.
So I'll take a quick stab and hand it to Junious, which is that I think that I know with a client I worked with last week, they were able to schedule out a 3-hour time. We did 2 hour and 15-minute sessions, but they appreciated getting out of the emergency response and into more of a planning, thinking phase. It was actually almost like for them a relief in a way. And so I think that the first thing is to check in with people. Do they have any bandwidth to think beyond what's right in front of them, to get off the dance floor onto the balcony? And then can you create a balcony space? And if people aren't ready, if you don't have a critical group ready, and it might be that you have a smaller group that can do that, but not the whole group. And then you figure out how can we do it with a smaller group, and then check in with those who weren't able to participate through one-on-ones or other things to share and get their feedback and perspectives. And so I just think you're going to have to be more flexible. And again, just always starting with that empathy and leaning into it and recognizing what people are addressing and dealing with. But, figuring out how to get the most out of the process. But I think if people are like, don't have the bandwidth, forcing it on them is not going to work. But as I said, what I found is with a group that was incredibly frantic, they appreciated taking a morning to get kind of on the dance floor and do some analysis. And so it might also, we're more than 40 days into this in a lot of communities. I think our schools were closed 40 days ago. That's like the biblical number for how long you're supposed to do these things. And we're passing that, right? So I think it's been long enough that some people are starting to come out of the urgency. They're still urgent, but they're able to at least create some balcony space in the coming weeks. Junious?
Um, this is, I think, a really hard one because if you surface the issues and you see that people are distressed, um, it's probably important to address that in some way. So I guess the first thing is you may have to lose part of your agenda, and you need to be comfortable with that. And if there's a lot of distress in the room, to just ask people, well, first of all, to give people permission to come in and out of processes. You know, we have this sort of set of customs and mores that you go and you stay for the whole thing, but really give people permission that if the topic is too much, or if other things on your mind are just preventing you from engaging the way you did, it's okay to just kind of send a little note and to drop out, and nobody's going to hold that against you. I think the other thing that I would just make a point of, and this is certainly not one of my fortes, but at least surfacing with folks whether or not there's anything that could happen at the table that would help you, and to make it part of the group's activity. If somebody says, I'm worried about this or that, and it's kind of preoccupying me, it's okay to see if, just ask people, well, would a little time in a group problem solving brainstorming be helpful to you? Or how could we as a group help you? But again, it's not assuming too much, but just really asking people, what do you want? What do you need? How can I help? And then responding to what they tell you, and not going off on your old agenda. If everybody's saying, no, stuff is just so out of control, don't want to talk, it's just asking, well, what would be a good agenda that would help people for the time we have together? Or should we just cancel for today and reschedule? But being really flexible as a facilitator.
Yeah, and one thing that we do, as I mentioned, we use the color check on our internal collective impact forum teams. And this is probably easier for more like a concrete team that does its work together over the long term. But we use it to do a lot of load balancing. And that can mean if someone's really in the red, for whatever reason it is, whether it's a family crisis or just overwhelmed with work, we think about how can we help you take something off your plate, because maybe one of us has a little bit more capacity or bandwidth to take that on. And so it's a very kind of tactical managerial tool, but thinking flexibly about the whole team getting to the result instead of every person just having a very narrow concrete work stream can be helpful if you have a team that can do a little bit of load balancing with itself. I see a good question coming in here in the chat, and that is, should backbone leaders necessarily take responsibility for the emotional conditions of the individuals? Distress should go to professionals. We can't do it all.
I don't think, I'm sorry, Junious, please.
I think you're absolutely right, but I think that, and again, I'm by no means an expert on this, but I think all of us who are managing processes need to be careful about trauma triggers, because, whether we recognize that, if you look at some of the traditional definitions of trauma, all of us are suffering from some level of trauma. So navigating it becomes really important to kind of make sure, and especially I'm working on a workshop now for next week, and I'm really torn about, do I want to even use the COVID-19 virus as a case example, and whether or not that's going to be so triggering for people that it will deflect from their attention on the issue. So for me, I think a big issue is one of just making sure that you're not navigating things in ways that create triggers for people that then, do need professional sort of resolution. So I'm talking more about just a general inquiry and asking people, how can we help you? And I'm assuming, again, that these are people that we've worked with on some level, even if they're not, as Jen was describing, a team within the same organization enough where if you put out a request, if there's something we could do to help, that people would feel comfortable enough to answer honestly.
I don't think it's the leader's job to fix or help someone's distress, but you can certainly empathize with it, and you can recognize it and acknowledge it and create the space both for people to not be okay, create the space for people to ask for help if they need it, and create the space for, again, for figuring out how people can come in and out and be flexible around work. And so I think as the leader, as the backbone leader, you can create a space for that. But it's not implying that therefore you're responsible for actually like counseling somebody but like, again, I think practicing empathy and really leaning into that. And then also figuring out how to create a space for people to fully be present, which is what a lot of us need right now, is just a space to like be not okay, or like, you know, today I'm having a hard time with one of my kids in their school, and it's like, that's part of my day, and we're all trying to wrestle with these things. So
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, so a question that's come in these changing spaces, how does one plan for remote working in the nonprofit sector in the COVID-19 affected environments where budgets are minimal?
can you ask that again, Jennifer?
Sure, and if someone wants to elaborate on your question, feel free. But you know, my sense is someone's asking, how do we plan for remote working for relatively long duration where budgets are minimal? And so maybe there are some equity questions here about access to virtual technology, internet access, and other challenges that pose themselves for cash-strapped nonprofits. And if I'm interpreting that wrong, to the person who wrote it, please feel free to add.
I mean, please, Junious.
No.
I think we're both a little bit. I mean, I think it's just hard, right? I mean, I think one of the hardest things is transferring from the way and so many of us do this work in places with people, and we're having to move it virtually, and it's really hard. And I think that, and the reality is, like, we're going to be doing this for a long time. It's not, you know, it's not, a switch isn't going to go on, a dimmer is going to raise a little bit at certain points, but you know, we're likely to be doing meetings this way for a long time. So I do think that we have to think about access. We do have to think about how we connect people. But it's, you know, I don't have a great response on that other than I think all of us are trying to figure this out at the same time. None of us have been through this before.
You know, I am glad that I'm not running an organization right now.
Yeah.
I'm a sole practitioner in my consulting firm. Boy, I would be frightened, to be quite honest, and I would be doing some scenario planning because it's not just the issue of the technology, but the issue is, for me, is one of fairness to the people who work in the organization, and being able to get as solid a picture of my budget as soon as I can, so that I can start contingency planning. If I'm going to have to downsize and stuff, to really get the signals out as early as possible to folks that we're going to have to reduce, to let people do their own contingency planning around their family financial needs and their career goals. So I guess that would be the thing, one dimension of it. But just realistically, as I imagine myself having been at my former organization and we were going remote, it wouldn't be an issue of access. And obviously some of the administrative support personnel and others whose work is much more difficult to transport home. But to me, I think the great challenge is being able, as quickly and as honestly and as accurately as possible, to tell people what the financial future of the organization is, and be expected that people are going to need to start making some contingency planning, and especially those who've got families to support and stuff, so that they can get out and start their activity as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's excellent advice on, transparent leadership in times of crisis and giving people some runway.
I was just reading an article in the Harvard Business Review online called "The Psychology Behind Effective Crisis Leadership" that talks about the importance of creating a holding environment for people and what it means to provide that holding space that allows people to think clear, have reassurance, orient people, and help them stick together. And it goes through a bunch of things. It might be a helpful resource for people thinking about that, but it's, as Junious is saying, like, you've got to, the leader's job is to really be clear and transparent and create the space for people to work through it. That the leader's job is to hold a container for people as well.
Yeah. Great question coming in here. So, and maybe I'll start with Junious on this one. In terms of pivoting on new priorities, are there particular consensus building processes that would be helpful to find common cause across partners, as organizations may have varying pressures or priorities? Oh, you're on mute, Junious.
Yeah.
Maybe you're refusing my cold call.
I'm sorry, could you restate the question for me?
Yeah. Are there particular consensus building processes that would be helpful to find common cause across partners as people are pivoting, because different organizations might have different priorities?
Well, I guess what I would suggest, and I'm doing this with one of my clients, it's actually 5 collective impact initiatives that had started a conversation about how they might align and coordinate their work. I think one of the things is to kind of disaggregate a bit what kind of individual organizational needs and concerns are, and from that being able to figure out what's common among a group of organizations or part of the collaborative that you can kind of elevate because they are issues of common concern, and to figure out, a collective strategy that's agreeable to everyone about how to move those areas of the work, but at the same time recognizing that there are kind of individual needs, and how do you support people in pursuing individual collaborative needs. So that's the way that I'm trying to frame the conversation that we're going to have among those 5 collaboratives. Let's identify what your individual needs are, and let's identify where there are commonalities, and let's put those in different buckets and figure out and build a consensus around things that you've already identified are common interest. But at the same time, realizing that you are in a collaborative environment, and the collaborative should also be able to figure out ways to support the individual needs, because if you lose collaborative members, you're losing the strength of the collaboration. So you want to manage both individual and common agenda. And I think once you get those things, then the normal consensus building processes are ones that you can apply to kind of strengthening the strategy or approach that people agree is a good way to pursue and achieve the outcomes that you've decided on.
Yeah, a couple of things that couple of resources I would also mention. Somebody had put in the chat box that mural.co is a good tool for virtual whiteboarding, and that might be something that helps you on the technology side of how to do this virtually. There's also a set of resources some of you may know called Liberating Structures that are a set of facilitation techniques. And I believe they've put up some guidance on adapting those for use in virtual environments. So Liberating Structures and Mural, MURAL.co are some tools that might be useful to check out for more of the technology side to that question. So I'm going to ask a question that's pretty specific, but I think we've gotten it on more than one occasion. So someone has asked, are there ways a recreation facility can help generate economic activity or support entrepreneurs during this time of crisis? So it's a specific question, but really looking at turning a recreation facility into a space for income generation or entrepreneurs. Have we seen any innovative examples coming up?
I don't know of anything. I mean, I would maybe just sit down with small businesses or entrepreneurs in your area and try to find out what kinds of things they need or are thinking about, and think about whether you have assets you could use to support them. I think that's, in an asset-based way, kind of just identifying what they've got and what you've got and how you might be able to help them. I haven't seen any examples of that specifically.
No, I haven't either. And I would just underscore what Paul said. Communicating with folks who have proximity to the facility, because it also sounds like you're almost shifting the function or focus of a facility. And that's a really tough transition to make right now. And I think it's especially important that you do a good job at market research to figure out what it is that would be attractive to entrepreneurs who would want to situate their business in your facility, and then also the amount potentially of cost in rehabbing what has been a recreational facility to have it be something that's suitable for an entrepreneur to run his or her business out of. So you're doing a couple of big leaps. And I guess the initial place is, well, it's clear that you have a need for revenue generation. I do a little of scenario planning around what are all of the ways that might be open to generate revenue. And you may already be there and have decided that you've got to figure out a way to attract those, but that's a really steep climb and a totally new line of business for you. So I'd be really cautious in doing that many jumps without a lot of good evidence that where I land is going to be in demand for folk.
Thanks both. So I'm going to toss out a pretty broad question, but maybe an interesting one for you all to muse on. What are some of the opportunities that might come out of this crisis that we might be able to take advantage of as collective impact initiatives? And I think you've already talked a little bit about that in terms of revenue generation. So keeping yourself relevant in order to, frankly, demonstrate your value to the community, but perhaps in terms of impact. What are some of the opportunities for our work that could come out of the crisis?
I'll start because I think they're all over the place. My greatest takeaway from this whole experience, and it's encouraging in a sense, but discouraging in a sense, America can do and can afford to do anything it wants to do. They are basically boundless opportunities for us to reconstruct this society. And when I see, what is publicly recounted as $2 trillion, and if you really look inside the numbers, about $6 trillion that we put in the various bailout bills. So there are no financial limits. There are no kind of social or other limits. So for me, the opportunity is we need to be having a conversation about what we want America to be in the post-crisis period. And for me, nothing is off the table. All of these things we've done in an adaptive way, many of which we should continue to do. So for me, I'm encouraged, and the most encouraging part of all of this is the realization that there are no excuses in America except a lack of desire to do things differently and to eliminate inequities and inequalities in this society. So I think that the opportunities are all over the place. We just need to organize and mobilize and demand that the political leadership actually move in that direction.
A friend of mine described this period as the metamorphosis, and that in a way we're in these cocoons now, and there's a lot of struggle, trauma, and challenge, but also an opportunity for a metamorphosis coming on the other end. That when we come out of it, people will be thinking differently about what's kind of society do we want? How should communities work? It will create opportunities for us to rethink our strategies, to rethink our systems change efforts, and also to think differently about how we work together. And I think that one thing I'm noticing is people are collaborating a lot better than they usually do by necessity. If you're right now focused on this is my organization and my mission, I don't see a great future. I think if you're focused on the people and on change and on making sure the community's healthy and safe and progressing, you've got one. And there's I do think there'll be a lot of opportunity coming out of this. But it's also going to be a really difficult interim period before we get there. And I think we got to buckle in. And in the scenario planning article, I shared a couple links. The New York Times last Sunday had a long analysis of what the next period looks like. And then Vox did a great explainer on 4 of the think tanks that have done plans for what phase 2 of this looks like. And I just encourage people, because I think, as I've spoken to people, a lot of people have a Pollyannish view that the governor of Georgia said, we're just going to start opening, it's not going to be we're going to flip a switch and everyone's going to start going outside and doing stuff. This is going to be a long haul. And so I think that familiarizing yourself with what that might look like, and again, potentially doing some scenario thinking about it, but recognize that on the other end of that, we will have vaccine, we will move to a new place. And there's a lot to learn from this experience. A lot to learn from this experience that we're going to get. And I would just add to that, in the whole context of all this, Junious mentioned the trauma before. We've got to pay attention to mental health right now for everybody. And for people who have vulnerable mental health, this is a real challenge. And I think that that's got to be, in my mind, that is the most important thing right now, is making sure that people are well, and the rest will follow. And I think that, there are kids struggling to figure out online schooling, who are suffering from depression. We got to deal with that. And I think Junious, before we got on, talked about San Francisco has decided everyone gets an A. And I think that we're going to have to we got to deal with that. So I think within your populations, within your communities, please pay attention to that with your employees, with your colleagues, with the people you serve, and recognize that's a big concern, and that wellness needs to be our first thing right now more than anything else.
I am agreed. And I think, as I would just add, as we think about opportunities, one thing that worries me a little bit is people are still talking about response and recovery. And recovery makes it sound a bit like we want to go back to where we were. And I think, building on what Junious and Paul were saying, I think it's an important moment for certainly response, but reckoning, and thinking about it more as reconstruction, perhaps. What can we create that looks different than it was before, instead of just recovering right back to where we were before. So that's a frame that I'm starting to use in my thinking and talking about what the future might look like, rather than just recovery. And so I'd encourage you all to think about what it looks like in the future, not going back to what we had before, because we know that was, those are not systems and structures that were serving all well. And this is making that more evident than ever. So I think that with that, that might be a good note to end our Q&A on for today. I do want to thank, this is the last of our 5-part series of our office hours. We've really learned a lot from those of you who we've engaged with, and it's been a pleasure doing this with you, Paul and Junious, and we had a couple other colleagues join us along the way. Our team is now turning our attention to being heads down, focusing on our convening, which will be held virtually May 6th through 8th. And so that is where we will be for the coming weeks, getting ready for that. I wanted to mention that Tracy is going to share a survey in the chat box. We'll share it also in the email as well. And we, as always, really welcome your feedback. If you are interested in further engaging, here I have information on our virtual convening. You can go to our website or click on the link in this presentation here to learn more. We are adapting the content to be timely. We have a lot of speakers and examples from across the country, and are asking them all to weave in a little bit about how they're responding to COVID-19, as will our plenary sessions. So we are adjusting to feel very timely in this virtual setting. And I also will mention that if you are a podcast listener, we have this year launched a podcast. We have a mix of different types of sessions. We have audio files from former convenings, as well as some sessions that our team has recorded that are around the nuts and bolts of collective impact. And it is a ever-evolving set of resources. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining today. I want to definitely wish everyone good mental and physical health, and best of luck balancing many priorities right now. So thanks all, and we really have enjoyed doing this series and look forward to picking up touch points with you again during and after our convening. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.